Hello, and welcome to the Capital Gains Show. Today, I am lucky enough to have my good friend Z join me for a casual back and forth where we're going to share with the audience a little bit about our ideologies and discuss and debate the relative merits of each. When I first met Z on the internet, um, he was more along the ANCAP side like myself, but he has since evolved or progressed from that ideology, and now he's a little bit more on the left. Z, would you like to tell us about where you stand now and what your ideology is in terms of like evolutionarily
Sure.
speaking? Yeah.
Yeah. So now I follow Marxism and more along the lines of Xi Jinping thought and Juche. But for this debate, right, I'm going to be mostly focusing on Marxism because the other stuff is too convoluted.
I
Yeah.
hear you. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, Sounds good, man. So Marxism, and you feel like right now you're more along the traditional Marxist path with do you feel like you're more along the worker ownership means of production, or do you feel more like there's a role for the state in the ownership of the means of production? Do you feel more like a planned economy is the way to go versus like a market economy, that kind of thing?
Not quite. The thing with Marxism, right, is that it's a materialist philosophy. So what that means is it bases itself around the current material conditions, like what presently occurs, like because the material conditions of back then are different from the ones from now. So it would be different depending on the nation you're in and the circumstances. So, for example, China has adopted market socialism as their means of adopting Marxism.
Yeah.
It falls in line more closely with Lenin's new economic policy.
Yeah.
Um, they progressed from their stage of communist revolution to what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Yes.
But in America, if it were to adopt a socialist revolution, it would look completely different from that of China, because
Yeah.
China, right, um, it came from a feudal, like before becoming communist, right? Before Mao's communist revolution, it was feudalist. While America, in terms of its history, it's a colonial society. Uh, it used to be a British colony, right? So yeah, it's taking its undertakings towards socialism would be fundamentally different from that of China. So it totally depends.
Hmm. What are your thoughts on how a socialist revolution would take place in North America, like the US or Canada? Do you feel like there would be room for more of a market socialism thing in North America since capitalism and markets are so predominant on this continent now? Or do you think it would move a little bit more towards or should move towards like a centrally planned or democratically planned economic thing? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on that are more complicated than that. Yes, at first, right, it would inevitably have to be a market socialist thingy because
Mhm.
people are already accustomed to markets, right, over there. But the path towards socialism in North America, right, and even South America would mostly be focused on decolonization and um, like balkanization of various states because there's too much division already. There's division of culture and there's division of particular ethnicities and uh,
Mm.
economic structures, right? As well, political economic structures.
Yeah, I got you.
Uh, do you know what I mean by balkanization?
No, I do know what you mean when you say decolonization, or at least I think I do. But when you say balkanization, I think I've heard that phrase before, but I'm not really familiar. Can you tell me a little bit more about balkanization?
The splitting up of states and provinces and whatnot.
So splitting up of states and provinces, that sounds more like a decentralization or giving more local power, right?
Yeah.
To like
Hmm.
cities and states and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, Go ahead.
Cool. I'm trying to think what's the next good question to ask you, because I want to get a good understanding and help the audience get a good understanding of your philosophy. But it sounds like when you say Marxism, normally I think of Marxism as like this traditionally defined, it was written down in the 1800s, centrally planned economy, centralized government, blah, blah. But you're describing something that has, you said it's going to be more, contextual based on the current circumstances and based on, whichever country it takes place in. So what we would see in terms of a Marxist revolution in North America might not be the same as what you see in China or in North Korea or what took place in the Soviet Union 100 years ago, right? So it seems like you're giving me an idea of Marxism that's supposed to be maybe a little bit more adaptable to the context in which it's taking place, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Like,
because it's a materialist and a scientific philosophy, right? So it takes into account the current conditions, right? Uh, for example, people have material needs, right? What are those needs? Food, water, shelter, uh, feeling of closeness, economy, production, so on and so forth. And we also live in a very interconnected world, right?
mm-hmm.
So in terms of the present era that we live in, right? We live in this privileged time, right? A privileged time that, of course, capitalism has made like possible, right? Capitalism has made it possible for us to even conceive of socialism to begin
Sure.
with, right? Capitalism is not 100% bad, right? I'm going to
Mm.
admit it right there. It's not 100% bad, right? It was necessary to come out of feudal conditions or whatnot, although it didn't really come out of feudalism. It came from Britain, but in terms of the present day era, right? Socialism, it'll come out of capitalism, right? It's the inevitable next step. For a while, it will still have certain characteristics of capitalism, right? It's
Mm,
inevitable,
mm,
right?
mm.
Because we live in this very interconnected world, right? It's not possible to abandon markets entirely,
Yeah.
right? These,
At least not in the short term, huh?
yeah, exactly. Within, those musings we had in the political groups and so on and so forth, right? That's these one single solutions, right? They never really work out because they're based on pure ideology. I want
Mm,
this, therefore it could be universally applied. That's not how reality works, right? We have
mm.
to take uh, statistics and so on and so forth into consideration. We have to take in the human cost. We have to take in how development will affect so and so, uh, process or this and that. There's the actual world of political study and political sciences is very complicated. It requires a lot of data crunching and this and that. For most people, that's boring because most people, right, myself included, right, we tend to focus a lot on the policies or the theories or this and that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So capitalism might even be like a necessary first step or prior to achieving, socialism or like capitalism has a role in terms of economic and social evolution, right? In your eyes, as like a path towards achieving socialism or true communism or what have you, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Yeah, I I like the idea of Marxism being more adaptable or contextual in the given in the given day or the given geographical area, as opposed to Marxism being just like a rigid, fixed, and self-contained set of, like you said,
Yeah.
pure ideology. It does make it sound more attractive that way when you say that there's context, and you say that there's supposed to be adaptability and a scientific aspect to it. I do say that I've heard a lot of, communists, especially the Marxist Leninist types. They'll say that their ideology is scientific, but then they just go into like these pure, like set in stone, concepts and frameworks. And there doesn't seem to be any adaptability to the present day. They're stuck in the 1800s, and they're sitting there, when I think of the word scientific, I think of something that would be more adaptable or more contextual or more, looking at the data, looking at the statistics, and then trying to devise a solution based on that. So even though I'm not a fan of planned economics, and I am still a fan of capitalism, it does make the Marxist ideology sound a little bit more reasonable and more appealing when you present it that way. So, I'll give credit where it's due, at least in the sense that you're trying to show that this ideology can be modern and can be adaptable and can work in different social, contexts and with different economic points. Because not every country is developed developed at the same rate economically. So what might be good for one kind of economy might not necessarily be good yet for a different economy, right? You got to look at the context there. So that's interesting. The question is like, how would you make the correct decisions in a given economic context? You're just going to have a bunch of planners, you're going to have a bunch of voters, it's going to be like a popular vote kind of thing, or maybe there'll be a representational system where people get elected and then set some sort of economic policy based on that person, the elected administrators, what they think is appropriate in the particular country. So say that Canada has a socialist revolution. I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, I imagine you would see like maybe a mixture of some direct democracy as well as some representative democracy, and then the voters at large make certain choices, and then maybe some representatives who get elected to certain positions, they'll make their choices based on, and they'll plan an economy based on what they see in the current economic and social context, something like that.
The answers to that question, right, can be found in both Xi Jinping thought and Juche. Juche solves these issues, right, by referring to the will of the popular masses. Now, what are the popular masses, right? The working class, the people who usually use services and benefit from them, right? The masters of production in their society are the working class. Like the masters in Canada and America, because it's a capitalist society, are capitalists, right? But it's usually what the working class prefer, right? Like the popular, because they comprise of the majority of the population, right?
Yeah.
That is what that is how our policy should be molded towards, right? What the popular masses desire, right? And as for Xi Jinping thought, right? He's kind of a genius, right? You may agree or disagree with me, right? But his thing is that like production must be increased, like our productive forces must be increased, right? Because the goal should be poverty alleviation. The very first goal actually should be poverty alleviation. And to do that, you need specifically targeted uh, like poverty elimination strategies, right? Specific to certain regions, right? Because each region, even in Canada, has its own culture, has its own like standard of living, and so on and so forth. To increase our productive forces, right, we must upgrade our machinery, we must upgrade our like how we produce and make it more efficient, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
I got a question for you.
sure.
I'm at least vaguely aware of Juche ideology. There's not I didn't find a whole heck of a lot of detail about Juche ideology on the internet, beyond, you know, the Wikipedia page. I imagine most of the writings on it have not yet been translated into English, but I'm, you know, being a fan of the whole capitalism versus communism debate concept. I've read what I can about North Korea. I've read what I can about, you know, Kim Il Sung and Kim Jong Il and the Juche ideology. And I know what you're saying about how it talks about, you know, it talks about self-reliance and worker empowerment, workers making the decisions, right, and alleviating poverty. But I'm not as familiar with the name Xi Jinping. I'm assuming that's a Chinese communist theorist or something like that, right? Can you tell me a little bit more about that person?
No, he's the current president of
Oh,
China.
wait, you mean the guy that they say
Yeah,
Winnie the Pooh, him?
yeah.
Oh, okay. Because I'm sitting there thinking like,
Yeah.
who's this from 100 years ago? He must have been like Mao's predecessor. No, you're talking about the current
No,
president.
no, the
Sorry.
current. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, it, I actually got to say, man, you know, China, we all know, and no one's going to deny that China's economy has been booming the past couple decades. They've been doing great work ever since Mao passed away. And of course, I imagine you'll disagree with me on this, but I like to think that one of the reasons China's economy has boomed so much is because I believe they've taken a path that's a little more permissive in terms of profits and private property rights and things like that. Kind of like how Lenin did the NEP when he kind of just took a step back from socialism and said, okay, we're going to have a little bit of markets now that I think about it, Russia's not ready to just go full on, you know, planned economy. Let's bring back a little bit, you know, Lenin was trying different things to try and help, you know. So it seems to me like that is a bit of what China did ever since, I don't know, I think they started doing that in the 80s and it seems to have accelerated since then. But meanwhile, North Korea has not taken that approach. They've stayed really hard on the planned economy thing. So I think, from what I can tell, there's a bit of a dichotomy there in how mainland China versus North Korea interpret and implement Marxism, right?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you're right, right? Uh, it was actually Deng, right? Like his name is pronounced Deng, but it's actually spelled D-E-N-G. Uh,
Oh,
yeah, Deng Xiaoping, right? Like he implemented that the thing that mirrored Lenin's new economic policy, right?
and
He didn't.
that happened after
Yeah,
Mao passed away, right? Shortly, like in the
yeah,
70s or
correct.
80s, right?
The reason why he implemented it, right, was although Mao's communism was successful in getting rid of the feudalism, right, that plagued China. Like feudalism in China was like just as bad as you'd imagine it, right? There was bonded slavery, there was oppression of the peasant class, and there were cyclical famines that kept plaguing China. Mao's China solved the cyclical famines problem, right? But the unintended consequence of that, right, was that the productive forces were slightly decreased, right? And China couldn't really compete against the world stage like that, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
They still had a ways to go.
mhm,
Even though Mao did those things, they had to go further if they wanted to compete and become a global
yeah,
superpower and become one
exactly.
of the major players in the global economy. And
Yeah.
it seems like they are kind of achieving those goals now, aren't they?
Hmm.
I mean, China's a real force to be reckoned with economically speaking, and their
Yeah.
culture is expanding too.
Hmm. So with Deng, right, like he didn't exactly privatize or anything. He just made the lands more private so that the farmers could have more decision making and could play a vital role in forming markets, right? Uh, they aren't exactly private property even now. It's just he made the management of markets more private,
Hmm.
right? Um,
So it's not really private property, but what they did is their policy, correct me if I'm wrong, allows a little bit more local autonomy when it comes to the
yeah,
farmers and how they control how the goods are distributed and sold and so on, right?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
With Xi Jinping, right? Although he allows foreign capitalists to come in, right? They have to abide by the CPC's rules and regulations, and failure to abide by them would mean closure or, you know, other varying degrees of penalties and whatnot for them.
I've I've read a bit about this when it comes to different communist parties, the ones that are in control of countries, Cuba and China and others. There can be a lot of variation between how they, how much permission or autonomy they allow for foreign companies and foreign actors to come in and set up base. For example, Cuba won't allow a foreign company to operate on the island. The foreign company can only operate as a minority stakeholder in that company that operates on Cuban soil. So, for example, if Michelin wants to open a tire factory in Cuba, the Cuban government has to be owning at least 51% of that factory, and then Michelin is only allowed to own up to 49% of the factory. So essentially the company can have some foreign ownership, but it's, by and large has to be, the party owned or worker owned or government owned, however you want to call it. But
Yeah.
I think China doesn't have that kind of rule. There's some rules, of course, but I think China allows more of a larger foreign presence, right, to operate economically, within their borders. And it seems that that a little bit more permissive policy is paying off in terms of their
Yeah.
economic growth, right, and in terms of their
Mhm.
interconnectivity and ability to trade with other countries. Because I mean, God, everything I buy now is made in China, right? I bet probably for you too, huh?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, the thing about that, right, is that socialist nations that are more uh, that suffer more from embargoes, right, and from sanctions, like North Korea and Cuba,
Yeah,
tend towards more of a command economy because their goal is self-reliance, right? They're trying to be as self-reliant as possible in the absence of resources that they may be missing. Because, like, how world trade is very interconnected, right? There's a reason for
yeah,
that, because certain countries produce resources or have resources that others do not have,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So they're cut off from that, and that, unfortunately, that's why they've had to adopt that, and that goes back to the materialist understanding of Marxism, right? Like, adapt to your material conditions,
Hmm.
right?
So maybe, so you think it's fair to say that countries that adopt a more command style economy and a more self-reliance economy do so out of necessity because they are persecuted or shut out from international trade for the most part, thanks to oppressive U.S. sanctions, right? And I'm no fan of U.S. sanctions. If it were up to me, I'd have all the sanctions removed immediately. Sadly, I did not win the 2020 election, but if I did, that
Yeah.
would have been one of my first moves to just end all the sanctions.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well,
But
I will when I think about the sanctions, one thing that stands out to me was just as a funny story is when Cuba underwent the Marxist revolution. Well, first they underwent a revolution period. The Marxism came shortly after, but Fidel at first was trying to be, I guess, friendly with the U.S. and they were kind of getting along. But then Fidel wanted to seize some foreign businesses that he felt were, oppressing the people or not paying fairly. And I'm not defending these businesses, but what he started doing was like seizing American owned hotels and factories and things like that. And that pissed off, of course, the capitalist class in the US. And those capitalists had the ear of the US president. And then the US president was just like, all right, F this, we're just gonna, shut them off. And he just signed a pen and totally cut off Cuba. Not exactly a fair move, not exactly a proportionate move, right?
yeah.
But it seems like when a communist party starts seizing businesses, to me it's kind of like, well, you're kind of signaling that you don't want capitalism, that you don't want trade, that you don't want to even that you don't want to even be interacting with these foreign businesses since you're seizing their property without compensation. So it's almost like they wanted to be cut off, or they wanted to cut themselves off from these capitalist businesses, and then they got their wish a little bit more than they bargained for. Having said that, of course, I'm not a fan of the sanctions. I don't think it was a proportionate move, but I'm not convinced necessarily that doing the command style economy was only reactionary to being cut off. It seems like they wanted to step in that direction. They wanted to go in that direction, and then the capitalist class just helped make it happen to a very severe and perhaps unfair degree. But I don't know. I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
Sure. There's a reason why they stepped more towards that direction, because uh, America, right, adopted like slave plantations over there, like through the forgot his name, the guy who was ousted by the Cubans. What was his name? Um,
I forget, Bautista or
yeah,
no.
Batista, right? Like
Yeah,
he had slave plantations and whatnot. The reason why
yeah,
they seized a lot of the hotels and whatnot was because they were like they were employing slave labor
that's right.
of the Cubans. So
Yeah, yeah. And it was a very unfair time
yeah,
back then overall, the way they treated workers. I'm not going to defend at all, the way those capitalists were treating workers, especially back then.
yeah.
I think, anyone from today, if they saw with their own eyes how it was going on back then prior to the revolution, they would probably agree with you, that labor was very forced and very unfair.
Hmm. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, of course, you're right too, right? That like because of them fighting back, right, they were sanctioned and embargoed. That's also true, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Hmm.
the thing is, right, the state is only an apparatus, right, by which a certain class uh, asserts authority, right? That authority could be a king or a queen, it could be a feudal lord, it could be an aristocrat, it could be a capitalist, or it could be, well, in the capitalist case, a bunch of capitalists, right? Or it could be the working class,
Yeah.
right? Um, like as a present, right, we only have the capitalist system and the socialist system, right? Um, but like the origins of the capitalist system, right? It wasn't really as like a bunch of capitalists or even some socialists would assert. It wasn't. It didn't originate in markets, right? It originated in Britain
Yeah.
as a result of like because the landlords there, right? The who were formerly the peasants class, they reallocated certain lands. I want to share my screen actually, so I can share.
Sure.
Just give me a sec. Let me find it. Sorry.
No worries.
Oh, and this is getting in the way of me sharing it.
Got a lot of tabs open there.
Yep.
Yeah.
There we
Oh,
go.
the enclosure acts. Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's take a look at this.
So, like, what happened, right, was that these former capitalists, right, they took over the lands which they deemed as inefficient, right, and then they privatized it. That like capitalism originally started as an agrarian form of capitalism before it industrialized, right? Uh, so like capitalism's history is rife with this thing called speciesism. Like it regards certain humans as inferior because they're unproductive or so on and so forth, right? So because these wealthy farmers, right, deemed the lands of the commoners as unproductive, right? They took over. Like it wasn't through a market process. It was a very particular social development. It was a need to be more competitive, but also to centralize resources even more.
Now, this image that we're looking at right now, when
Yeah,
we see the before and after, what the way that this transpired was the rich landowners petitioned the I don't know, the British Crown or the British legislature, right, the lawmaking governing body in England, for permission or the right to seize or appropriate these
yeah,
lands, right? Because they said, oh, well, it was like a kind of eminent domain in a
hmm,
way, right? They said, oh, we'll be more productive if you give us control of these lands or give us titlage. And then that's what they did. And they basically grabbed it and then privatized it, right? And through government power, right?
yeah, correct. Yeah, like this particular social arrangement only really occurred in Britain. Well, it started in Britain, right? It because if it were like true that markets led to capitalism, right? Wouldn't capitalism spontaneously erupt everywhere,
Yeah.
right? Which it didn't, right? Um, Even colonialism, right, is vastly different. Like depending on the, like it took different forms, right? In Spain was more of a feudal society, right? And they took over the land of the New World through conquest, right, and slavery. While first, right, like Britain was kind of a latecomer to the colonial game, by the way, right? Relatively around that time, right?
Yeah.
It's since expanded, but first Britain colonized Ireland, and the manner by which it colonized it, right, was the same as this enclosure thingy right here, right? It enclosed the land of the commoners, right, in Ireland, and when it moved out to the New World, its colonialization strategy was genocidal. And yeah,
Yeah. It a lot of people, you know, even though Britain may have been a relative latecomer to the colonization game, I think their story and their particular history of colonization is perhaps the most well-known and most famous, in part because it was probably one of the most brutal, right? The way they
yeah,
subjugated entire continents, the way they you know, nosed in on all these places. And you know, that's why like half of Africa has stuff named after, you know, Queen Elizabeth or Queen Anne, right? And that's why like Hong Kong, all the streets are you know, like named after, you know, British monarchs or British lords and stuff. That's why all these English words are used to name all these faraway places, because Britain was so brutal in the way it, you know, forced itself onto the rest of the world, huh?
yeah, correct.
Man, I've seen before the argument that, you know, that capitalism or the private property concept originated, you know, in Britain with the farms and you know, the government over there agreeing to give property rights to these rich landowners who said, oh, you know, we'll be more productive with it. You know, we'll give you more tithings or more taxes or whatever, you know. And of course, you know, getting control of those lands, I guess, increased their profits, you know. But when we look at what modern capitalism is generally defined as today, it's much more of a private property rights permissiveness kind of thing. You know, people associate it with
Yeah,
laissez-faire. um and of course, you know, being an ANCAP myself, I like to think, some people disagree with me, but I like to think that private property can exist without a government, although governments can um, grant title to and defend property rights. It's not necessary for them to, it's not necessary for a government to exist in order to defend private property rights, because private property rights can be defended by private parties, just like in the same way you don't need a government to build a road, you don't need a government to enforce private property rights. It's just that they are capable of doing it. But I think a private property, a private party, like a private security agency or something along those lines, can defend those private property rights. You may not agree with me on that, but I want the audience to understand, you know, my position there.
Sure. Well, that position is generally common in America, right? Or even in Canada, right? Because
Yeah.
the way the society and its culture has been structured, right? It's forced, right? Like, remember the social development of capitalism I was talking about earlier?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's structured its society in a way, right, where people are like beaten up over the head, right, about this thing about capitalism being competitive and you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? It's
Mhm.
this hedonism, right, that leads to philosophies like that, as well as certain misunderstandings about the material history and development of capitalism. Like
Sure.
there are two terms, right, that really describe it well. And it's the commercialization model of capitalist development and the classical theory of primitive accumulation. Do you know what I mean by primitive accumulation?
Primitive accumulation. Man, I don't know if I've heard that term before. Can you tell us a little bit about what that term means?
Yeah, primitive accumulation is the process by which the rich farm owners uh, back then in Britain seized the common lands and appropriated it into private property, right? Like
Hmm.
enclosed it, right? That is
Primitive
primitive,
accumulation. So
right?
primitive accumulation is a means of how the capitalists got private ownership of those lands, of those means of production, so to speak, right?
Yeah, correct. It's how it developed, right? How capitalism originated, right? But like the problem with the general like view of people, like I don't mean any offense in this or anything, right? I'm not trying to say people are dumb, right? But like people have been beaten over the head, right, with this idea that capitalism developed organically, that there was no material development or no societal change that led to the formation of capitalism, right? That it just formed organically through voluntary exchange, and this that's not the that's not the case, right? Like if that were true, then capitalism would have formed independently across the globe, right? Uh, but it didn't.
Hmm.
It formed largely due to conquest,
Hmm.
and it was a matter of political contention.
I see what you're saying there. Um, I feel like I think there may be room for both. There's no doubt. There's no doubt that oppressive governments had a large part in the spreading of capitalism across the globe. In some cases, they would beat people over the head with it, right? But
Yeah,
it, the thing is I also see a lot of black market or non-state sanctioned activity organically emerging, everything from the gray market, like unlicensed barbers or unlicensed contractors, to things like the drug market, and I mean like illegal drugs and things like that. Also, you can see things pop up organically. Here's a funny example. Washington State not too long ago banned a certain type of additive in soap, like dishwashing soap. And what emerged in that state was a black market for certain kinds of dishwashing soap. I mean, like, and that emerged voluntarily or organically. But at the same time, it's absolutely true that a lot that capitalism was artificially implemented or forced onto a lot of places, onto a lot of societies. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I don't think that the artificial forcing of it is the exclusive means by which it spread, but I mean, maybe you don't consider black markets for dishwashing soap to be capitalistic, but I do. I consider that, a form of capitalism. But I would say it's definitely the most popular system today, and I think it's spread both organically and artificially, you know. But then again, I would say by contrast, I don't see I don't see Marxism or socialism spreading organically so much as spreading artificially as well, in the same sense that a government would force capitalism onto a subcontinent. The people are political parties or political minorities are fomenting revolutions that artificially and abruptly implement socialism or start building socialism in given societies. Like the Cuban Revolution was, do you consider that more organic than, say, England showing up on some island nation and implementing capitalism? Which of those is going to be more artificial? I think maybe they're both artificial. Did I lose you? Like, look, if Fidel Castro shows up on the Grandma boat in Cuba and marches into Havana and starts a communist revolution, is that more organic than, say, some Spanish explorer arriving on an island and trading gold for spices?
It's the inevitable result of capitalism's failures. It's the reaction from people that is organic. It inevitably happens. It occurs as a result of societal change. The reason why colonization is more artificial is because there's a religious aspect to it too, right? The need to convert what they deemed as subhuman, or the people who they deemed as subhuman, because they didn't consider Native Americans human at all. They or even blacks, like they considered them like that goes back to the whole speciesism thingy that I was talking about. To subjugate certain kind of people, right? They considered them lesser than them.
That's true.
That's the dogma that was going around.
Yeah, definitely back then. You don't see it so much today, but definitely back then there was a lot of this, we got to bring these godless heathens to Christ and the white man's ways, right? There's no denying that was a big element of it. That was a big part of the colonization, right? That's why Christianity or Catholicism is so popular in South America today. Whereas a couple hundred years ago, no one down there practiced Catholicism, right? That's why everyone down there speaks either Spanish or Portuguese, which are European languages. That's why everyone speaks English in North America, right? Because those things were kind of forced down everyone's throats, and this kind of manifest destiny thing was all the rage back then. Yeah. Now, but when I think of modern capitalism, I mean, you're not going to see today someone trying to force Christianity onto an indigenous people's, consciousness. What you're going to see in terms of capitalism today is maybe Amazon opening up a fulfillment center, and then offering, free shipping to a whole new geographic region,
Yeah. Back to a previous point, I'll get to that point too, right? Yes, I don't consider black markets to be capitalism. They're more of a means of curtailing sanctions or laws, right? And capitalism does not mean markets. Markets formed before capitalism.
That's
right?
true. That's true.
North Korea even practices black markets too. That doesn't mean they're capitalists. They have sanctions against a whole bunch of things, right? And the newest sanction was against their sand. So, because they were producing computer chips and so on, so they're selling it abroad and so on and so forth, like through black markets. But they've recently been sanctioned. So, and sanctions kill people. Yeah. Now, with regards to Amazon opening up fulfillment centers and so on and so forth, philanthropy is it's a means by which CEOs try and paint this corporate image that they're beneficial to society, that their wealth trickles down and so on and so forth. It's really a guise for tax subsidies and so on and so forth. They get tax subsidies for that. They have no other reason to do it. They have they get tax subsidies for that, and tax subsidies is basically free money.
Yeah, tax subsidies. I mean, it's one thing to get, sometimes these companies get governments to give them money And I think that's a bit different than just convincing a government not to take your money in the form of high tax rates. But either way, if a company has a lower tax rate than the rest of the people around it, in effect, you've got somewhat of a subsidy there. Now, I, of course, would say the solution to that problem is to get rid of taxes, but I don't think you would want to get rid of taxes. You'd probably want to just raise the corporate tax rate to match what rate everyone else is paying, or something like that, right?
Not quite. It's really difficult actually to form a meaningful solution to, right? But I believe that corporations have no place in government. It should be the working class who should be in charge, right? And like any revenue generated by corporations should be like reallocated towards the public good. Like the workers should because that's the next step after capitalism, actually, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And in that, the hierarchy between capitalists and workers switched so that the workers are above the capitalists, right? And they get to determine how much, like, um, how much the capitalists give back to society and so on and so forth. And where it's allocated and stuff like that.
Yeah. I think I see what you're saying, and I like that sentiment too. I like the idea of the little guy having either primacy or having more control over their situation than some rich capitalist. Okay, but here's how I see the solution for me. And a lot of leftists that I talk to say, okay, look, what we need to do is we need to get corporations out of government. The government should be controlled by the workers, by the voters. And then, but what I see is a problem of regulatory capture. The more powerful the regulating body is, the more severe the consequences are when it gets captured by capital interests, right? By big business interests. And regulatory capture is something that's, in my opinion, at least, inescapable for all regulators. I mean, it always happens, man. The regulators always get captured by the moneyed interests, by the ones that have the most money and the most power. And then those guys, of course, they infiltrate the regulators and they use the regulators for their benefit rather than for the benefit of the workers, of course. Now, here's my solution is if you get rid of the regulators or if you minimize the regulatory power, this will actually elevate the power of the workers in the form of more consumer choice. Instead of having a captive consumer base, instead of having a high tax situation where the regulators get this guaranteed stream of income that the capitalists exploit to their own ends, if you have more consumer choice and more market forces, and then that's when the capitalists' power is diminished, because they're going to have to work harder for their meal and they're going to have to work harder for their profits, because the consumers are going to be more likely to pull their dollars away. They're going to be less likely to buy whatever the capitalist is selling. Having more consumer choice and having more individual autonomy. And I don't mean individual autonomy in the sense of everyone gets to vote and then just like implement this monopoly policy that they voted on. I mean more of like a market-based consumer kind of thing. That's when you're going to see less regulatory abuse, less regulatory capture, less dominance by Amazon. You won't see the things like tax subsidies or government handouts or bailouts. You know what I mean? That's why the market, wanted, for example, the market said, hey, big banks, you guys should all go out of business. And then the government stepped in and said, no, we're going to save you. You know what I mean? So removing the regulators' power to do those kind of things is going to make those big businesses more likely to fail when they fuck up and when a crisis happens. And I think that's good. That kind of situation would be good for the working class, for the consuming class. Don't you think?
Two or three things, actually. Capitalists are inherently bad at business. You may or may not agree with me, but they're inherently bad with business. The system itself is unsustainable. I can go on to it later on as we move on, right? Secondly, within socialist societies, right, the goal is not to increase bureaucracy. That actually occurs within capitalist societies. The more political and corporate interests are intertwined within capitalism, the higher bureaucracy increases. Within socialism, the worker parties, right, they seek to cut bureaucracy by splitting government roles and increasing party membership. And yeah, that's it.
Less bureaucracy. I understand that sentiment. I think I may have heard that once or twice from other leftists about reducing bureaucracy, but you know, it's one thing to say it and it's another thing to walk the walk. What I see is the more democracy you have, the more micromanagement you're going to have. You know, like a lot of people, they say, oh, the workplace should be just, you know, controlled direct democracy, no representative democracy. And that's how we're going to give real power to the workers. But what that means is, you know, like when you implement that, what ends up happening is you have to have a company-wide vote for the purchase of every hammer, for the installation of every screw, you know, for every widget that gets produced, there has to be some vote. And the bureaucracy expands. You know, the more votes you have, the more voting sessions you have every day, the more bureaucracy you're going to have necessarily, as opposed to when you have a more of a privately run enterprise where everything, where decision making is you know, divided, you know, in a labor sense, where you have a division of labor of making decisions, and you let some manager be autonomous in how many widgets are produced, or you know, the design of a particular product, as opposed to having it voted on all the time. You're going to have less bureaucracy, not more. Now, in the real world, to use the Soviet Union as an example, I know they weren't like you know, a lot of people contest how socialist they really were, but at least they were self-declared socialists. And the USSR was well known for having way more bureaucracy in it than, you know, the economies of North America or Western Europe. And of course, there's bureaucracy in capitalism, no doubt, but it seems to me that, you know, in real world implementation, bureaucracy is more of a problem the less free market activity you have. I would imagine socialism can hopefully avoid the bureaucratic, you know, the excess bureaucracy problem by doing more of like a market socialist thing than a command economy kind of thing. But you know, from your position, it seems to me that your question of whether you should have command economics or market economics is going to vary depending on the context of the given society that the revolution is happening in, you know.
So we definitely cannot just switch overnight to worker based, like worker-owned factories overnight, right? There needs to be a gradual change towards there, right? And it could start by voting for our bosses or so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Like little changes like that, right? And these changes generally span multiple generations. Like it won't. There's no possibility of it happening within a single generation and whatnot.
That's
Um,
true. A lot of
yeah,
people want it right now, though. You notice how people are impatient and they want to see these things happen within their lifetime, capitalists included. But I think you're right. It helps to have a longer perspective. I
yeah,
agree with you there. And that's true whether you're a capitalist or a communist. I think it helps to have a wider, multiple generational perspective in terms of getting somewhere, because you don't want to just like burn the whole thing down and start from scratch and then everyone's back in poverty again. Having like, you know, a gradual implementation, you know, for the communist, maybe that'll just be, you know, that transferring ownership gradually to the workers and giving them more control. And for the capitalists, that would be gradually selling off the government bureaucracies, as opposed to just burning all the buildings down. You know what I mean? Right.
yeah, of course. I mean, that's where sometimes anarchism fails, because it tries to rush things. It tries to rush things towards
Mm.
statelessness. The goal of both Marxism and anarchism is the final stage of communism, that is the stateless classless society, right?
Yeah.
But if you try to rush it, right, it leaves you open to a multitude of problems, right? You could be like killed off by imperialist forces, by fascist forces, by or your productive forces are not high enough where you have eliminated poverty, or so on and so forth. These, because we don't live in a perfect world, right? These are inevitable, right? Now, with the case of bureaucracy, right? I think you kind of misunderstand the whole purpose of bureaucracy.
Okay.
Uh, Bureaucrats within capitalist nations align themselves with capitalist interests and so on and so forth, right?
Yes.
They don't go away even after a socialist revolution, right? And Russia, the Soviet Union, it came out of a feudal society, right? Relatively, its bureaucracy was shrunken from back when it was a feudal society.
I
The
suppose that's possible. Yeah.
yeah, like a bureaucracy is utilized to protect corporate interests in a particular manner, right? Or to protect the commercialization interests of a particular. They don't really determine regulations, and um, again, you may or may not agree with me, but I don't necessarily think regulations are a bad thing if used to the correct, uh, like if used correctly.
Sure.
I happen to have worked in a factory before, right? I know myself the benefits of certain regulations and the drawbacks of others, right? Certain regulations like HACCP or GMP are necessary to ensure there's no pesticides in our food, that there's no metallic substances in our food, that there's no that our food is like generally healthy or clean or whatnot, right? Not every company follows that, by the way, right? Like sometimes, like
Sure.
going to McDonald's or some other place, I feel icky because I know they don't follow it well. They don't wear hairnets. They don't make sure their food is clean or fresh. Sometimes the employees even spit in the food, right? If you give them attitude, and that's generally not. Like I believe that regulations ought to be followed better, right? In terms of safety and
I,
like health.
let me try and clarify a bit, because I agree with your point right there. When I badmouthed regulations a moment ago, I wasn't aiming at, like, the food safety standards, which companies should choose to implement and rigorously follow for the protection of their workers and the consumers that choose to dine at their restaurants. But I was talking more like, regulators that say, oh, it's illegal to catch too many fish, or you're not allowed to cut hair without a license from us. Those kind of regulations, those artificially imposed regulations from the powers that be. Like capitalists like to protect themselves from competition, and the capitalists that are already rich, they'll buddy up with the bureaucrats, and they'll say, look guys, let's make these new rules that limit competition in the industries that we're dominant in. You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden the barriers to entry in a given economic sector become extraordinarily high, because those capitalists are using regulatory capture to limit new entrants into that sector. So that would be the kind of bad regulation that I'm not a fan of. Not the food regulation. That stuff is fine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of that either, but
Yeah.
it's not exactly regulations, it's lobbying. They lobby their preferred governmental candidates and whatnot, right? I could show you an example, like Justin Trudeau, like Canada's prime minister. I've got the list over here. Let me just,
Sure, go ahead.
yeah. Um, and there was the V charity scandal too recently.
He's had a lot of scandals, hasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, these companies, right, are, you see it, right?
Yeah.
These are his corporate donors.
Oh, that's a lot of money there. Look at that, almost 3 million. Then you've got
Yeah.
500,000, a bunch of multiple hundreds of thousands.
Hmm. I mean, this kind of corporate monopoly and whatnot, it's inevitable under capitalism, because the more wealth these companies accrue, right, the more they'd want to keep it and preserve it, right? Going down and under is expensive. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's a reason why they don't adopt these laissez-faire policies that are commonly found online, right? They don't want to get rid of their monopolies. They like their uh, they like how things are. Because it grants them more power, it grants them more money. They get to lobby these governments so that they have more like I mean, so that small businesses generally have a barrier to entry, right? Um, Small business owners, also referred to as petit bourgeois, are also alienated from achieving these the standards, like the upwards
Mhm.
climb that the bourgeois ruling class within capitalism have, because the bourgeois' private interest, right, is to transform the labor, right, generated from the lower classes into capital, and capital, right, it's earned through leisure, right? Like it's not earned through labor. They do complex manipulation to, try and get capital to increase, right?
Yeah.
Not everyone is capable of that, right? But um, like small businesses in themselves, they're a problem as well. They're vastly inefficient, and sometimes they can be more exploitative towards the worker than the higher ups, right? Like
Mhm.
small businesses have a failure rate of 20% within the first year and 50% and higher within the first 5 years, right?
It might even be
Um,
higher than that, but yeah, it's high. It's a high
yeah,
risk endeavor.
mhm.
Yeah.
It's a high risk, right? But the thing with small businesses is, if they want to stay afloat, they've got to merge with they've either got to merge or stay stagnant if possible, right? That that's very iffy, right? But mostly they tend to try and merge with larger corporations, right? uh, Capitalist investment, mostly it's because, like, I mean, currently I work in the film industry, right? And there's
Mhm.
like I've been to these board meetings. I've done pitches and whatnot. Like, I mean, I've helped out with them. I haven't actually done them, right? But I've helped out with them, right? With pitches and whatnot, like,
Yeah.
because you have to pitch your idea and whatnot, right? But mostly capitalists tend to invest within markets that are safe and very familiar, right?
Yes. Yes. Most investors are risk averse.
Yeah.
There's always some high risk, investors or people that are really speculative, but the vast majority of investors are looking for a stable, profit margin kind of thing, a
Mhm.
stable return. They're looking for
Yeah.
safety in terms of where they're putting their capital. Absolutely true.
But that's also why capitalism doesn't generally innovate. It's mostly the people who take up on the risk are within governmental organizations like DARPA or NASA or whatnot. They generally take up the most risk within investments because they can take the burden of.
Governments do sometimes put their resources into higher risk endeavors, and that's probably one of the reasons why governments have a relatively high failure rate when it comes to investing or backing certain projects. Like down here in America, in the USA, there's countless examples of governments giving either bailout money or loan money to these startups that end up failing spectacularly shortly thereafter, and then everyone laments the wasting of the taxpayers' precious dollar, and that's because it's doing these relatively high risk investments. Solyndra was a really big example for the viewers. You've probably heard that phrase before, Solyndra. Yeah. That's just one of many. Hey, I want to get back to the monopoly concept you were talking about just a couple minutes ago. You said something that I absolutely agree is true. You said that the capitalists try to monopolize, right? They try and erect really high barriers to entry and give themselves like a guaranteed revenue stream or a captive consumer base. They want to be the only game in town, and they don't want any consumers to have a choice, right? Or they want to minimize consumer choice and maximize their profits and maximize their revenue. But so I'll agree that that's a problem, and that the capitalist class works with the government to try and make that happen. But what's the Marxist alternative? How do you see competition increasing in Marxism. I mean, that most of the time, most of the leftists that I talk to, they seem to badmouth competition. They're not fans of consumer choice in particularly, maybe in the abstract. But if I say, oh, let's have like a bunch of competing car companies, you know, they don't necessarily like that idea. It seems to me that most of the time, not everyone, but most of the leftists want monoliths in certain economic sectors. Like this widget, there's only one company that makes this widget, and the widget is identical, you know, no matter where you shop at. So it's like, what do you? But I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think is going to be the Marxist or the Juche solution to the problem of capitalist monopolization?
So I mean, I've never heard that argument really from leftists, but if they have, right, it's incorrect, right? Like it's
Okay.
not how markets work in real life, right? And even when you're starting out the revolution and whatnot, competition would have to be increased. But
Increased. So
yes,
you would want to see more competition between worker co-ops and things like that. You would envision a world of more consumer choice in terms of like consumer products and things like that.
not more consumer choice, really, right? It's complicated, right? Like it
Mm-hmm.
would, like as I said before, right? It wouldn't jump to worker co-ops instantly, right?
Yeah.
Like worker co-op and representative democracy and whatnot, like it would be increased, right, gradually over time, right?
Okay.
But beforehand, there are other problems that we need to address, right? Such as poverty alleviation, right? Poverty alleviation doesn't just mean giving free handouts and so on and so forth, right? To increase competition, right, you must also decrease barriers to entry.
Yes.
To do that, right, you need to increase your productive forces, right?
Mm.
And to increase the productive forces, investment must be made towards increasing certain machinery, certain infrastructure, rebuilding certain infrastructure, building new homes for people, and so on and so forth. Right? It's through these processes that competition is increased, right, temporarily until uh, poverty is eliminated in said region and cooperative forces can be made possible, right? Like it might be confusing, right? Because you may have heard this the first time, right?
I'm trying to follow the logic chain, but I'm not sure if I understand how the competition, how the desire or the need for competition or the realization of competition is going to change depending on how much poverty there happens to be in the society at any given time. I like to think of competition as something that's always awesome everywhere. You know what I mean? Not conditional, but I
Yeah.
don't know if you want to, if you could expand a little bit on that thought for me.
Competition within most Western nations of the global North, it's very hedonistic. It's made in a way where, uh, and this is also about division of labor, right? It's literally a guy eats guy world kind of thing. Y- Do you agree with me? Like,
Yeah, well, like in an economic sense, a dog eat dog or a person eat
yeah, dog
person.
eat dog. Yeah,
Yeah, you got to be cutthroat in an economic competitive sense, or else you're gonna die, right? Like
yeah,
you're gonna go out of business, so to speak.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But unfortunately, that's not how material reality works,
Hmm.
right? Within these capitalist nations, there are multitudes of barriers of entry towards the lower classes, especially if you are from the lower class, right?
Yes.
Um,
It's
like
easier for a
it's
rich person to get a business loan than for a poor person
yeah,
to get a
because
business
they
loan.
generally get it from their parents, right? They're
Usually,
yeah,
some, but not always.
not always, yeah. They generally get it from their parents or from government subsidies and whatnot. But
Oftentimes.
I mean, like this hedonistic culture masks the reality of what is actually going on. Um, they do it successfully through propaganda campaigns and whatnot. Uh, but I mean, the reality is, if you want more competition, you have to give means by which people can rise up, right? People can escape their general sense of poverty.
Yes. I think we agree on the notion that it is important to lower or minimize the barriers to entry in any economic sector, especially for people of modest or limited means. So
Yeah.
as a capitalist, I would say, well, that means you want less economic regulation from on high. You want more access to things like bank loans. You want more access to things like courting outside investors. You want more access to things like having friends and family, contribute to your startup. You also want to have more. As a capitalist, I'm actually a fan of worker co-ops. I don't think they should be mandatory, but I like the idea of workers choosing, if they want, to have a personal stake in the ownership of a given company. So you got to maximize the ability for workers to have an ownership stake, whether they buy into a company or they're given stock as the company arises and grows. But those kind of options need to be available for people and I think that those tools and those mechanisms will enhance competition and increase the ability for people to go upward, like mobily, economically, right? What do you think?
Um, well, that's only one part of the puzzle, right? But if you don't focus on increasing productive forces, you generally cannot uh, erase barriers through.
What do you mean when you say improving or enhancing productive forces? I mean, the term sounds simple enough, but I'm worried that I might not be understanding the context, what you mean it by. How can you
Sure.
give me an example or elaborate on that bit?
Yeah, I'll give you an example, like a real world example, like in China, right? Uh, in a particular village, right? They the problem, right? You know how I don't know if you live in a city or not, do you?
Yeah, I live in Los Angeles. It's a pretty big
Oh
city.
yeah, yeah, that's right. You live in I live in Toronto.
Toronto's
But
a
like,
really big city too, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. We're generally accustomed to technology. We understand it, right? We know how to use Wi-Fi. We know how to use this, right? But they don't over there, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So the the poverty alleviation solution there, right, was to teach them about the benefits of 5G and the Wi-Fi and how it could automate certain processes of their production uh, in agriculture, and how they could use the online global market to sell their resources, right? So
Pretty cool.
investment there was done so that they could install 5G towers, they could install automated machinery that relied on the 5G towers, and to help them set up online resources so that they could like sell their red rice thingy, yeah,
Mm.
globally there.
Artisanal rice from a faraway place in China. It makes it sound so exotic and desirable. Every Whole
Yeah.
Foods shopper is going to want that artisanal rice, right?
Hmm. But my point is, you can't just eliminate poverty by getting rid of regulations when the people are already poor. You have to help increase their productive forces. That is their machinery as well, right?
I think I got you. So
Mhm.
you increasing productive forces means like more access to the global economy, more automation, more technology, more infrastructure, right? More
Yes,
investment
correct.
in those things that we take for granted. That's all around people like you and me.
Hmm.
Those things aren't as available to a faraway rural community, right?
Yeah, and,
Okay,
and
I got
and productive forces must be advanced everywhere, right?
you.
We can't just have cities becoming super productive and super automated, because that would get rid of the businesses that the farmers in rural areas so rely on, right? Uh,
Hmm.
right, we have to focus on alleviating poverty there, right, so that they can rise up too, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
And
sure.
capitalism, like one critique of it is it increases productive forces a lot in urban areas, but it ignores the productive development in rural areas or suburban areas and so on and so forth. Right.
Hmm.
I don't live exactly right in the heart of the city in Toronto, right? But we have so many MPs and so on and so forth, right? But nothing is being done. Like, I'm not kidding, that nothing is being done in the suburbs,
I see. It's like the
right?
suburbs are getting ignored, and
Yeah,
places like Toronto get all the attention and all the
yeah,
love, right?
mhm,
I see.
yeah.
Man, I agree that the cities get more of it, but I think that capitalism and increased I think that maybe not necessarily capitalism, but the free market, from what I've been seeing, at least anecdotally, I think the free market brings more access, more access to productive capacity in rural areas, because there's so many artisanal small town products and goods and services that are available now that weren't necessarily available even 20, 30 years ago. Maybe this is mostly just because of technology and the internet, but I see more faraway lands offering their things. I mean, I'm consuming rock music from Mongolia. I wouldn't have been able to do that, 15 years ago, but thanks to YouTube now, I find this cool Mongolian rock music band. I recently found this really cool sword making company from like Montana or Idaho or something, some faraway rural place in the cornfields in America. Never would have heard of this company until recently, thanks to technology and the internet and free markets and their ability to access a world market through the internet. All of a sudden now people like me can discover these kind of small town companies now. So instead of just buying knives from the big factory in Chicago, I can get knives from a small, low volume, handmade kind of black forge kind of company that's way off in the mountains. Although, I got to be honest, part of that argument could be, it could be like, well, that's not capitalism, that's just technology spreading. Maybe that's true, but I feel like I have more access to these faraway places than I did before. I don't know if you feel that way at all.
Yes, definitely. Globalization of capitalism has led to a world becoming more interconnected, and products that weren't originally available here are now available, right? I agree with that, right? There are problems with that, however, right? And
Mhm.
that lies within the realm of imperialism and colonial, well, imperialism now, because that's the general policy, right,
Yeah.
of American foreign intervention, so on and so forth. Imperialism also can relate to markets as well, right? Like Burkina Faso's like previous socialist leader, right, who was assassinated, unfortunately, right? He made clear that food aid is a form of imperialism. Now, do you understand what is meant by that?
I think so. Let me take a stab at it, and then I want your take after I take a
Yeah,
stab at it.
sure.
Okay. So let's say that some big rich Western capitalist country, approaches a less advanced place and says, "Oh, we see you guys are hurting. Maybe you're hungry. We'll give you some food aid." And they promise a bunch of grain or something. But along with that comes a lot of strings attached, right? Okay, we'll give you this grain if you open up your markets and so and such, and you let our foreign companies come in and set up shop and start, extracting value, extracting labor value, or whatever it is, or we want to come in and start strip mining your mountains, and we'll give you the grain in exchange. Am I on the right track here?
No, there are no strings attached.
No.
But the problem is, right? Well, I mean, that occurs with or without food aid, right?
Okay. What
That's
I
not a
described does happen sometimes, though,
that's not
right?
a necessary condition of food aid. The problem with food aid, right? Just simply giving food aid, it makes people reliant. It makes people
Yeah.
like just dependent on it. They don't do anything after.
I've
They
heard,
yeah,
yeah, I've heard this before. I think I know what you're talking about. Where, for example, if you give a bunch of free food to a society that's far
yeah.
away, it's like that society won't be able to develop their own domestic food production capacity,
Mhm,
because how do you compete with free food? How do you start a food production company
yeah.
when your consumer base is already getting free food from someone else? And now
Yeah.
you don't get that domestic development because of that food subsidy, essentially,
Yeah.
right?
If you want to alleviate poverty, then like advance the infrastructure there, right? Build water wells, build rice farms or whatever farms over there, and like help. That's how we eliminate poverty. Just
Mhm.
simply giving free handouts and whatnot does not eliminate poverty,
Definitely
right?
not in the long term. It might alleviate poverty very temporarily because you get a free meal, but then what about tomorrow, right?
Exactly, right. That's no way to like that's the socialist critique of liberalism and welfarism as well, right?
Yeah.
See, socialists don't really like welfare and this and that, right? They're um, they're very immediate short-term solutions to the larger underlying problem of inefficient resource allocation and inefficient productive forces within capitalist societies, right? Uh, like if you, like I said before, if you want to actually increase like the like if you want to eliminate poverty, then you got to increase productive forces and so on and so forth
Yeah. It's
within the
it's
societies.
teach a man to fish, not give him free fish, right?
Yeah, yeah. Teach a man to fish, invest in them, like help them get a fishing boat and so on and so forth, right? And then they'll be able to feed their community,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, yeah. I think you and I are on the same page there. I definitely agree that for a real meaningful and long-term and sustainable way to alleviate and reduce poverty, I think I agree with you that you would need to increase productive forces, improve infrastructure, develop that productive capacity, and that's how you're really going to get poverty alleviation. And believe it or not, even though I'm a capitalist, I am very keenly interested in poverty alleviation. When I see poverty rates go down, it makes me feel good inside. And I think it makes you feel good inside too. It's just funny how we both identify. I think we're correctly identifying a problem together, but our prescribed solutions are vastly different, right? I want to see more privatization, more private property, more profits, more opportunities for outside investment, absentee landlordism, wage labor, and you don't want to you don't want to see those things. You want to see more democracy, more worker ownership, more maybe more command economy, but that might be contextual for you based on what place we're talking about and what time we're talking about. Because it seems like you're not necessarily opposed to markets. You just see them as as maybe a possible contextual solution, not an absolute fundamental solution. The way I see markets as a fundamental solution, right?
Well, with regards to that, there are different phases towards achieving socialism, right? China has only just accomplished its first phase of socialism. It's going on to the second phase, right? Second phase involves more worker management and whatnot. But you
Hmm.
can't do worker management of the economy without um, first alleviating poverty, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Poverty alleviation is the first step of socialism. And also with regards to privatization, right? Privatization does not decentralize things, right? Contrary to what Mises or Rothbard may have asserted, it doesn't decentralize anything. What tends to happen with privatization is that particular regions of production, right, are centralized into one branch. I'll give you an example, right? In Toronto, where I live, right? Um, there's a corporation called Metrolinx, right? And it vied to privatize the public transport industry, right? Between a few major cities like Toronto, Vaughan, uh, Mississauga, Brampton, so on and so forth, right? By connecting all of the all the transfers, like the tickets, the tokens, and whatnot, right,
Oh,
into
okay.
one card system, right? Like
Yeah.
you just tap and so on and so forth, right?
Ooh, so
But
convenient.
yes, the general idea is very convenient, right?
Yeah.
But there have been problems with it, right? Because the people are not generally in charge, right? When things are privatized, right? Like privatization also occurs within economies of scale, right? Where there's a need for centralization, like medicine or transportation, right? But because of that, right, people generally don't have a say. They feel left out. They feel alienated, right, from what they actually want. What's generally happened was a lot of the machines that were used to load the fare into the Presto cards, right, uh, were faulty. Sometimes they'd eat the cash. Like a vast majority of them are faulty, and they
Oh no.
also raise the fares by 30 cents, 30, 40, 50 cents, like within the times. Like privatization has problems because it is outside of the influence of the people and what they actually want, right?
Mhm.
They installed, they're currently developing this project, right? I can show you the map. Just give me a sec.
Sure.
Okay, let me share the screen.
So you're going to show us a map of the transportation routes
Here's
in
what the
Canada?
yeah, here's what the transportation system looks like right now, right?
Okay.
And here, no, hold on, sorry. Here is the Eglinton LRT right here, right? That they're
Yeah.
currently building.
That orange
So
line?
far, yeah, so far I believe it's only been built till here, right? But there are problems, right? Privatization doesn't really mean that the money revenue that's coming in is from like sales and whatnot. It usually comes from taxes, right? They delayed 9 months. They still got the money. They delayed for 9 months, right? And there were a whole bunch of structural problems and so on and so forth. Here's what it looks like so far. Uh, just like it was also generally unpopular because uh,
Hmm.
instead, like they proposed that it would decrease traffic, right, and whatnot, right? Like they
Yeah.
said it would decrease traffic, but what I found is it actually increased traffic, like the whole
Really?
construction.
But
Yeah,
did
yeah.
ridership decrease and then people turn to cars more? Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not it, right? I mean, it's normal for traffic to increase during construction and whatnot, right?
Okay.
But some parts of it are operable, right? But like it reduced the general 3 or 4 lanes, right, into only 2 lanes of where the cars could go by, and
Ah,
like they through the whole debate, right, in between making it on the ground or underground, they messed up the whole construction, and it's been delayed by 2 years. It's
wow.
generally very inefficient
That
because
sounds
the
like
people,
so many passenger rail projects that I've heard of. You know, California had a debacle, Boston had a debacle, and it sounds like Canada's experiencing the same thing with their light rail.
yeah,
Wow.
but privatization is, I would disagree that it's not an efficient means of like forming market decisions, right?
Hmm.
Now, privatization can be made, like it can be transformed within a market socialist platform, right, towards a means where it actually benefits the people, right, through a mix of a command and market economy, right? Like where the command economy run by the Workers' Party actually decides how this infrastructure and where it is built, as opposed to them having no say and only the corporations having a say as to where it is built, so that it benefits their like corporate interests and so on and so forth, like highways and a majority of subway stations, right? They're built so that it benefits business flow and whatnot. So like
Yeah,
they're intentionally designed to benefit a certain business route. They connect to
yeah.
central business places. Capitalism isn't exactly decentralized.
Hmm.
It,
Uh, Getting back to that, the concept of decentralization, a moment ago, you said that you don't believe that privatization decentralizes. I, I agree with that, but on a very technical aspect. But you're right, privatization itself doesn't necessarily decentralize, and a lot of private interests work really hard to prevent or minimize decentralization. I think we can agree with that. But they do that through the regulatory process. They do that by getting a hold of the bureaucrats or getting a hold of the powers that be or the politicians. I think that the way to decentralize is to maximize the influence and accessibility of the free market. Decentralization is expressed or is seen in the act of competition. The more competition you have, the more you can be assured that your system is decentralized, at least in my mind. So, and it's like I've said in the past that I believe the free market is not a friend of the business; it's a friend of the consumer. And there's a tension, there's a push and pull between the business, the producers and the consumers, just like there's a tension between the capitalists and the workers. And a free market gives more power to the consumer, who I define as the little guy, just like the worker is defined as the little guy. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to agree with you that privatization itself does not lead to decentralization. You can have a privatized monopoly in a sense, right? But what I want to see is less regulatory power, less barriers to entry, less command economics, less planned economics, and more of an open market where anything goes. And I feel like that is the path to more decentralization, because I think you seem to be a fan of decentralization in at least to some degree. But you don't, I guess do you not see the market or competition as a path to decentralization? You think decentralization can be achieved like through popular vote or something? Because to me, voting is like the most centralized form of economic activity.
um, well, not quite, right? I don't see decentralization happening as a result of voting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, things will become centralized again, right? But in the meantime, right, while our productive forces are being increased, right, uh, like decentralization would, I don't know. Um,
Do you not see decentralization as as superior to centralization? Do you feel like it's just contextual given the
it's
circumstances?
definitely contextual. You
Or
can't
one can be
apply
better in your mind?
you can apply decentralization everywhere, and on like you can't make everyone on the same page, even within a single nation. You can't make everyone on the same page, right?
Mhm.
Development varies depending on a different nation, like a different city or a town or so on and so forth. Like every place's development is different, right? Every place
Yes.
has a different resource, right?
Yeah.
um, but I don't necessarily believe that decentralization and centralization are opposing forces, right? They can be made to push development towards a path where, like, it leads to poverty alleviation, so on and so forth. Now, with regards to the free market capitalism, this and that, right? The dilemma you have to overcome is you have to like prove to me that it's materially possible in the real world, that such a regime has existed, right? And it can be successful, because from what I understand, right, is that capitalists are generally bad at doing business, right? That
Mhm.
CEOs are just mascots for corporations, that they're not generally useful, and so on and so forth.
Hmm. I actually think I saw that headline in your Facebook feed that said capitalists are bad at business, but I didn't get a chance to read the article yet. I wish I did, because then I feel like I might have a more meaningful response to what you just said. But I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea that capitalists are bad at business. At least a lot of them are. Some of them are better than others, but I would at least concede that there's no inherent reason why a capitalist would necessarily be better at business than, say, a democratically controlled co-op, right? I'm totally willing to entertain the idea that workers collectively controlling their own enterprise might do a better job of it in terms of, you know, efficient production and, you know, satisfying consumers' desires than, you know, some dictatorial CEO, I'm the boss and I just give, you know, commands to everybody kind of, you know, system. I'm willing to entertain that possibility, but I would say that the best way to get any kind of enterprise to be good at business, whether it's worker controlled or whether it's CEO controlled or whether it's board of director controlled, would be to expose it to competition, to make it have to work for its meal, in the sense that, like, hey, look, if I don't do a good job at making this widget, someone else is going to do a better job than me. They're going to make a better widget at lower cost, and everyone's going to go consume that widget, and then I'm going to sit here with a bunch of unsold inventory and a bunch of losses. You know, that's what I see the role of decentralization coming in, because it increases competition. I don't feel like centralization in itself is going to be as advantageous to efficient production as decentralization is. And I will agree, like, you know, right now, pretty much every economy on earth is a mixed system where there's elements of both. There's elements of decentralization and there are elements of centralization. And some types of economies lend themselves more to one or the other, right? Like having a light rail, a commuter rail transportation network. It's harder to decentralize that maybe than centralize it, just because of the nature of how it operates. But overall, I would say that the economies that have a greater degree of competition and decentralization are the ones that realize more efficient production in general, because the competition is what incentivizes the efficient production, is what I see. So places like, you know, comparing South Korea to North Korea, for example, I feel like South Korea is more decentralized than North Korea, and South Korea enjoys a higher quality of life and more efficient production. I see you shaking your head. You probably don't agree with me there. Okay, well, tell me your thoughts.
Well, I mean, generally, decentralization, centralization debate, it's just catchwords, right? The reality is, as I said in the beginning, right? It's the
Yeah.
world is very interconnected, right? It relies on particular trade routes and so on and so forth, right? To
Yes.
operate itself, right? And I mean, because of the coronavirus pandemic, it's kind of, you know, it- these processes are kind of in danger, right? Because
Yes.
right. Uh, but I mean, like North Korea's development was actually much better than South Korea's up until the fall of the Soviet Union. And South Korea began as a military dictatorship,
Yes, that's right.
right? That was implemented by America.
Until like the 80s or something, right? I think, am I
Right.
wrong? Somewhere in the
Yeah.
80s, South Korea kind of stopped being
Yeah,
so
with the
dictator.
fall of the Soviet Union, right? America and other Western powers heavily sanctioned uh, North Korea. The development of North Korea, as of recent, it's actually picked up pace, irrespective of the sanctions. They just finished developing their military deterrent, right, against possible nuclear warfare and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
And now they're focusing towards their economy. They, like in some ways, I'd argue they're much better than America, right? Like they
How
they
so?
had a they had a typhoon there, right? And their leader, like, and the volunteer army there, they built homes, right? They they built homes like for the people who lost their homes, right? And they built it much better than that's kind of unheard of in America. They still, like Flint, Michigan, still has its water crisis. Like
That's right.
America is vastly richer than North Korea, and North Korea can still rebuild homes after a typhoon when it's heavily sanctioned. What does that say about America? Right.
Yeah.
What does that say about a nation that only uh, like worries about its short-term profits, and it doesn't care about increasing productive forces for its people, right? Especially the people who are laboring, right? Who comprise much of the labor. They don't care about them, right? If you don't care about your people, how do you expect them to push the nation along?
True. Um, I agree with that point, but I think I've got a pretty good counter to it. And I'm going to use the Flint, Michigan water disaster as an
Sure.
example. The Flint, Michigan government, the democratically elected representatives in the Flint City Council were the ones that made the disastrous choice to change their water supplier for the municipal water utility that had a government sanctioned monopoly on pumping water into everyone's pipes. Of course, we know the story. Massive contamination, deaths, disease, lead poisoning, terrible. Well, right now, as of today, and you're right, America, the American government rather, treated Flint very poorly and continues to do so. They still haven't fixed the problem. The water coming out of the pipes is still contaminated. So, but there's still people that live in Flint. So obviously they're drinking clean water somehow. How are they getting their clean water? Through private water suppliers. I mean, like, like Dasani or Arrowhead, those, Sparklets. There's these private water companies that stepped up and began delivering private and safe, clean, privately produced, safe, clean drinking water. And there's more than one provider. There's multiple private companies that are providing water to the Flint residents so that they can have clean water. I feel like the Flint story, you'll probably disagree with me, but I feel like the Flint story is a situation where the private sector came in and rescued and alleviated the problem that was caused by economic planning and democratic control. That's the story that I see.
Well, there's two things, right? America doesn't exactly have a democracy.
That's true, but there
Yeah.
are democratic processes that happen, in
It's
city
it's it's
levels.
all political theater. This goes to the critique of liberalism by Marxists, right?
Mhm.
Um, right. The capitalist class owns the government and state, right? And also from my own personal experience, right? I've found that many of these elected representatives and whatnot, they've only gotten into power because of how much money they've had, right? They don't have an inkling or a clue of how to run things efficiently. Actually, it's only
That's mostly true.
because, yeah, it's only because they have enough money, right? And they usually align with corporate interests and so on and so forth, right?
That's right. They
um,
usually get bought out by the corporations.
yeah. And with regards to private companies, I heard in Flint, Michigan, that Nestle uh, used a fresher water supply or something like that. Like it, it's the reason why Flint, Michigan has its issues, right? Like that's what I heard. I'm not 100% sure, but that's
I'm not.
private. It's like a case of private companies stepping in to fix the problem that they themselves caused. You know,
Yeah, maybe some people have said that. There was some criticism of Nestle in the way it tried to step in and provide water. I suppose they wanted to make a profit or something, but I don't know. I don't know
yeah.
either way. I haven't heard that Nestle was part of the. I don't know that Nestle contributed to the problem. From what I understand, it was a decision made by the city council. Those people were democratically elected, and they chose to change the water source for the municipal water utility. But I do know that a lot of private companies, there's a combination. Some private companies are selling water to Flint at, either wholesale prices. I mean, they're making a profit, but they're selling it at, like, wholesale prices. But there's also a lot of water donations. A lot of companies donated pallets and pallets of bottled water, as a humanitarian exercise. So there was a lot of compassion there from private companies to help alleviate the disaster that the public sector put onto the shoulders of the Flint, Michigan residents. And because so many people are poor in that town, it's not exactly a rich town. Not everyone can just afford to buy bottled water for all their water needs. So the donations are really helpful, especially for the low income people, in the city. Yeah.
They wouldn't care to donate, like again, the philanthropy thing, they wouldn't care to donate if they didn't get tax breaks. It's fine and all right, but
Sure.
donations do not help alleviate poverty. It's a type of
Yeah,
water poverty over there, right? It is better to fix the infrastructure, right? Which they still haven't done.
that's right. They still haven't done it. I
Yeah.
believe I believe that, and you know what, the infrastructure in terms of like the water pipes that pump water into everyone's homes, that's still controlled, by the local government over there. I believe that if they were able, that if they decided to try and privatize it, at least to some degree, that it would probably expedite the resolving of the disaster, expedite the relief. It would probably expedite the cleaning up, because it's like, the pipes in everyone's homes, the pipes underground, they all got contaminated. So the poison's in there forever until you replace the pipes. I mean, that's obviously going to be a very expensive repair. But if you brought in private capital, it would probably speed along the repairs. There's a reason why private enterprise has a reputation for doing things faster and less expensively than governments overall. There's always exceptions to that, but I think most of the time, the private enterprises are usually more efficient in those regards, even when it comes to utilities like water or energy.
Generally, private companies, they suffer from this thing called deadweight loss. It's this problem that occurs, right, when they've centralized too much, right, and they've obtained a monopoly within a certain industry or service or whatnot, right, like healthcare or whatnot. Deadweight loss occurs when the supply and demand don't generally match up with prices and whatnot, and the
Mm.
consumers suffer for it. Um,
Yes, I agree with that. And that's why decentralization, and like, I agree, like privatization doesn't necessarily bring decentralization along with that, right? I agree with you on that point. I also agree that the more monopolized a system is, the more deadweight loss it'll have. That absolutely makes sense to me. Decentralization, it seems like you seem to be cool with decentralization, at least in certain contexts, and it sounds like you agree that decentralization allows more efficient use of economic resources. So,
yeah.
you know but keeping the water utility in Flint under control of government is never going to decentralize it. That's going to maximize the centralization of it, right?
Yeah, of course, but you got to understand that America's government isn't exactly people's government. It's a corporation,
Yeah, regulatory capture, is
right?
what I attribute that to.
And corporations buy American policies. They buy, uh, like, the more you donate to their government, you've practically bought them out. You bought out their policies. That's why
Oh yeah,
the views of the popular masses in America never align with what the popular masses actually demand. Uh,
I
it
agree with
aligns more so with the corporations, and it's a sign of an inefficient government and so on and so forth, right? A government can be centralized or decentralized, but generally, if it's ruled by a capitalist class, the competition is it's pushed towards the wrong ends. It's pushed towards class warfare, right, and class divisions, and like that's generally why liberalism is it's a garbage system, right? There's no other
that.
ways,
Yeah,
right? Right.
I like that phrase, a garbage system. Hey,
Like if you notice, right, that like the Republican Party and Democrat Party have practically almost the same donors, right?
yeah,
They're in bed with one another, right? But they try and divide their people up into, oh, you're a liberal and you're a conservative, and you got to be at each other's throats. And they create wedge issues to divide people, the classes up, basically, right? That's how they maintain their power. They get away with doing criminal activity, right? Well, what we'd consider criminal activity with me, but like to them it's all hunky-dory, right?
yeah,
Like they're just playing by the rules of the game, right?
I
But
agree. I agree. Look, we're almost out of time, man. But I can't believe 2 hours has gone by already. Because I got to say, it's really fun taking a deep dive with you. But I've got a question for you.
Sure.
Do you I don't want to try and make it sound all black and white. So if you want to put nuance into this, that's fine. Let me ask you this: do you overall consider competition between producers and among producers a good thing and desirable, or not?
Um, it's a good thing until it's no longer needed.
Okay, so like kind of conditional. It's like a phase, I guess.
Yeah, it's a phase. There,
That's how you see
like
it.
the history of humankind, it's been phases of development, phases of like class structure, different class structure and whatnot, right? But it always it tends down to who is the basic foundation. The basic foundation of society are the working class, right? And it's the inevitable next step after capitalism is socialism, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Um,
So it is, so competition has its place in an economic development
yeah,
in the timeline, I guess, of
yeah, in
economic
the
evolution.
yeah, in the timeline of economic evolution, it has its place, but uh, like it can't go on forever, right? This unlimited like competition, this and that, right? Eventually, like societal development, right? Because societal development changes over time, right? We haven't always been competitive, right? And we haven't always been in a capitalist society. Capitalism is relatively a new thing, right? Even capitalism had its phases. It started out as agrarian capitalism, then transformed to industrial capitalism, right? After a certain point of wealth accumulation,
Yeah.
right? And like over time, even liberalism, right, which is the political structure which capitalism operates under, right, has transformed. Like liberalism, neoliberalism, social democracy, or but generally, capitalists are united in their class interest, right? That's to accumulate as much capital as possible, right? Um, like that's that's an improper use of competition, right? Because it doesn't generally benefit others, right? And it leads to less competition for the lower classes because they have no upwards mobility, right? Upwards mobility in a lot of countries nowadays is dead because capitalists have essentially snuffed it out,
Hmm.
right?
Well, I do see a lot of headlines that talk about more stratification of wealth, where a rich elite control an ever increasing percentage of the total economic output of society. But I'm also seeing headlines that say poverty is going down globally, and I mean it's uneven, but overall, there's less people living in poverty today than there were 50 years ago, and the percentage of society that's considered wealthy is going up, whereas the percentage of society that's considered poor is going down. So one side is, the rich side is growing as a ratio of the people, and the poverty side is shrinking as a ratio of the people. And if that is true, I think that's a good thing. I want to see more rich people, not less.
Uh,
I don't expect the growth to be perfectly even and balanced. It's going to be uneven. There's going to be concentrations and blah blah blah. But as long as it overall, see, I mean, inequality can go up while poverty goes down. Is what I'm getting at. A lot of people think those things go in lockstep, but I don't think they necessarily do.
yeah, but generally, poverty alleviation has mostly occurred in China. Poverty is actually increased in the West as a result of rampant neoliberalism
Hmm.
and rampant inequality. If you want to increase poverty, then you have to increase upwards mobility. Um, like you have to create the necessary conditions for that, and neoliberalism fails at doing that.
Hmm. Wow. Well, I think I have a great refutation to that, but I want to let you get the last word here. Maybe we can schedule a future talk.
Sure,
Not too
absolutely.
far from that. I hope you had fun, because I'm having a lot of fun talking with you. I thought your stance was going to be very Stalinist when you said the word Juche before, but it looks like you've got a lot more nuance
Yeah.
and introspection and a
Hmm.
lot more interesting ideas that I enjoyed hearing from you.
Yeah.
Even so I was having fun.
Well,
I was
whenever
over.
someone likes the Soviet Union, so it doesn't mean that they want to apply the Soviet Union's policies to the world now, because the world back then was vastly different from that of now, right? Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
and same with me, just because I like the Juche philosophy and Xi Jinping thought, right? It doesn't mean that I generally apply it in North America or South America, right? Like the truth is, me and you, right? We're just debating ideas and whatnot, right? We're not statisticians. We're not the people who work in government, right? We don't make research papers regarding, like, of course, professionals would be, involved with the whole planning and whatnot of society, right? Like you got to study it before you actually make it, kind of thing, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
right, and that's also true within socialist society, right?
Yeah.
Like, but generally, socialist society respects the working class more, right? It pushes their needs towards uh, uh, to each their own labor at first, right? To each their own work, right? It seeks to eliminate poverty and find people meaningful means of employment, right? And to increase the productive forces, right? And then that is later transformed to each of their own means, to their own like labor or whatnot. Like
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, man. I get your point. Um, well, you know what? It was a lot of fun. I hope that everyone that was watching had a good time hearing about all these ideas. I had a lot of fun talking about them. We'll probably, if you're down with it, we'll probably schedule another discussion sometime in the future. I like the casual back and forth format.
sure,
It feels natural and
yeah,
easygoing, and I like the questions we were able to ask each other and the ideas. I think I found more common ground with a Juche Marxist than I thought I would. We
mhm,
agree a lot on what problems are. We agree a lot on how corporate interests can cause problems for society, even though we have
yeah.
just different prescriptions and solutions. I think you and I see a lot of the same problems, and I think we want the same goal, which is the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, One point I missed out on, right, was that like
Okay,
it's about the Juche philosophy, right?
okay.
Like it also seeks to flatten hierarchies within the government, right? Like with the death of Kim Il Sung, right? Like the role of president was abolished, and with the death of Kim Jong Il, right? Like the role of premier was abolished, right?
Hmm.
Like they flattened the hierarchies out by splitting government roles and increasing party membership, right? Um, like s- socialism, it also generally makes more people more class conscious, makes people more intelligent, I would say, right? Because you have to be intelligent to manage society in that way, right? Like
Yeah.
in the absence of a president or the absence of, I mean, like you'd agree with me, right? We've outlived our need for presidents. What do, right? Besides
Sure.
fuck up things every 4 or 8 years,
I
right?
agree with that.
Yeah, right.
I've been trying to tell everyone who will listen, let's just not have a president for a while and see how that goes.
Yeah, yeah, right. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, there we go, man. I don't know.
Yeah,
You're starting to sound like an anarchist again. Look out.
yeah.
All right, man. Well, I'm going to stop the recording now because we're out of time. The time flew by. Everyone, thank you for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and hopefully I'll get Z on again in the channel in the near future. Thanks so much,
Awesome.
everyone.
Yeah.